Our reading this morning is from 1 Kings chapter 10 and reading through into chapter 11 as we come near the latter part of the reign of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel. When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relationship to the Lord, she came to test Solomon with hard questions. Arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan, with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold and precious stones, she came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind. Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon, the palace that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. She said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I didn't believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth, you have far exceeded the report I heard. How happy your people must be. How happy your officials who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness." And she gave the king 120 talents of gold. And some of you may have a footnote in your Bible which says 120 talents is about 4 tons. So she gave the king that much gold, large quantities of spices and precious stones. Never again were so many spices brought in as those the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. And then, in an aside, Hiram's ships brought gold from Ophir. And from there they brought great cargoes of almug wood and precious stones. The king used the almug wood to make supports for the temple of the Lord and for the royal palace, and to make harps and lyres for the musicians. So much almug wood has never been imported or seen since that day. King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired and asked for, besides what he'd given her out of his royal bounty. Then she left and returned with her retinue to her own country. The weight of gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents, not including the revenues from merchants and traders, from all the Arabian kings and the governors of the territories. King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each shield. He also made 300 small shields of hammered gold, with 3 minas of gold in each shield. The king put them in the palace of the forest of Lebanon. Then the king made a great throne covered with ivory and overlaid with fine gold. The throne had 6 steps, and its back had a rounded top. On both sides of the seat were armrests, with a lion standing beside each of them. 12 lions stood on the 6 steps, one at either end of each step. Nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom. All King Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. The king had a fleet of trading ships at sea, along with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years it returned, carrying gold, silver and ivory, and apes and baboons. King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought a gift: articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons and spices, and horses and mules. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Kew. The royal merchants purchased them from Kew at the current price. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and the Arameans. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter: Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray.
Well, thanks very much, John, and good to be with you today. If you don't know me, I'm Brian Harris, serve as pastor at large here at Carey. And in our series, we're looking at some of the accounts from Samuel, from Kings. And the king I'm wanting us to look at today is King Solomon. And I've called what I'm about to say Solomon the Almost Great. Solomon the Almost Great. I think that it's Jonathan Sacks. He used to be the chief rabbi of London, died about 2 years ago. Makes a comment that as you go through the Hebrew Bible, in fact, as you go through the Bible as a whole, it's kind of unique in ancient literature in that as you read it, you discover that the villains have virtues and the heroes have flaws. The villains have virtues and the heroes have flaws. That's quite unusual because actually in ancient literature, heroes were heroic and amazing and without flaw, and villains were just awful and terrible, and that was that. But the Bible is a lot more nuanced than that. And so as you read through one hero in the Bible after another, you kind of recognize that there are flaws everywhere. So for example, think of Moses. I mean, Moses was a great and an amazing leader. He was truly heroic. He did so many extraordinary things. He led the children of Israel to the promised land. But like the moment we say he led them to the promised land, what do we remember? We remember that he didn't enter the promised land himself, and he didn't enter it for a very specific reason. It went back to that time in the desert of Zin, when the Israelites, the Hebrews, were without water, and in anger, Moses lashes out and hits the rock. And we're not quite sure what's entirely wrong with what Moses did. If you read the accounts, you find them in Deuteronomy 23, Numbers chapter 20. It's not crystal clear what was wrong about it, but it seems as though Moses' faith wavered at that point, that he was just exasperated, that he tried to take things into his own hands. Whatever, the outcome of it is that God says you can lead the children of Israel to the promised land, but you can't actually enter it yourself. And so when we speak about Moses, there's always a sense in which we say, Moses was this great, extraordinary leader, although, of course, except that, almost. And that little qualifier always feels so very, very sad. And that happens so often in life, doesn't it? I can remember when I was at school, which goes back 50 years now, but we had a maths teacher, and I'm going to call him Mr. Smith. Now, Mr. Smith, that wasn't actually his name, but the story's not entirely flattering, so I'm wanting to be fair and to let him rest in anonymity. He was a great maths teacher. He was just extraordinary. He was so funny, and he was so logical, and he could kind of break down the most complex problems and help you to realize that actually they were completely solvable. But he was also a real character. And truth to tell, I think he was an alcoholic, because he would often arrive at school and he was clearly not entirely sober. And we rather liked that, because Monday morning, first thing, it was quite nice to kind of have a teacher who felt as miserable about the start of the week as you did. And he would kind of sit at his desk and lament, and the lesson would get off really very slowly and with good humor, and we didn't mind at all. But as I say, he was actually a really good teacher, so he would make up. When he got going, he'd get going really fast and we'd catch on very quickly, and it was just really good. And he just had this wicked sense of humor, and I remember those classes as being filled with just laughter and insight, and they were great. Except that one day, we would have been about 14 or 15, one of the boys kind of joined in the banter of the class, and I suppose it was a little cheeky what he said. I don't remember what it was that he said now. But when you're 14 or 15, you don't always get humor right. You try to be funny, and sometimes you miss it altogether. And he said something, and it just didn't work. And Mr. Smith just went ballistic. And when I say ballistic, I just mean ballistic. And he leapt out of his seat. And he picked up this kid, and he just threw him across the class. It was actually really dangerous. If he did that today, he would have not just been fired, he would have been in court. 50 years ago, nothing happened. But as a class, we kind of rose up and protest, you can't do that. That's just not right. You've lost control, and that's just not right. And Mr. Smith just stormed out the class and didn't come back for the rest of the lesson. And after that, our relationship with him was never really quite the same again. He was still a great teacher, and we still sort of liked him, and we still joked, but we always thought, you're wonderful, but we've seen another side to you. You're almost amazing, but you're not really amazing. Heroes have flaws, villains have virtues. Life is like that. And as you look at this account of King Solomon, it was a long passage that John read to us, wasn't it? But it's trying to emphasize, how great Solomon's time was. He was a really wise king, and he was a really wealthy king, and it was a really successful time for Israel. And he was, often he's called Solomon the Great or Solomon the Wise. But when you read all of the accounts, you realize that you actually conclude and you say, actually he was Solomon the almost great, and Solomon the almost wise. Now, let's go back to where the wisdom part starts. So if you go to 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon is early on in his period of being just been appointed king, and God comes to him and says to him, Solomon, just ask me for something. I'm your God, and we want to do this together, and I want to help you to be a good king. So what do you want me to give you, Solomon? And Solomon actually shows that he's quite wise already at that stage, because Solomon could have said, I want you to give me extraordinary wealth or all kinds of things. And he says, God, please, the one thing I ask of you is I find this very daunting to lead these people. It's a large group of people here. It's a complex task. Won't you give me wisdom? Make me a wise king. And God says, well, that's a great answer. Yes, I will certainly do that for you. In fact, you've been very wise to ask for wisdom. You're showing some wisdom already. And if you remember the accounts of Solomon, we of course see quite early on an example of his wisdom. You might remember the account, and it comes for you in 1 Kings chapter 3, from verse 16 onwards. There are two women. They're prostitutes, actually. And they live together, and they each have a child. And one night, tragedy strikes. One of the women rolls over in her sleep, rolls over onto her baby, and the baby dies. And she recognizes what happens, and distraught and desperately still wanting a child, pinches the child of the other woman who's also in the house, substitutes the babies. But of course, when the other woman wakes up, she sees this dead child next to her, but knows it's not her own, and realizes that the other baby is. And so immediately says to this other woman, like, how can you take my child? You can't do that. And it's like, but it's your word against mine. And like, these women are anonymous. They're two anonymous prostitutes. They don't really have any identity in society, and who would know whose child was who? And so it escalates to the king. And do you remember Solomon? It's like the defining account of his wisdom in some way. I mean, I'm not sure that a judge today would act in quite the same way. But as these women bicker with each other about whose child this child actually is, Solomon at some point just says, stop. Like, I've got a good solution here. Like, so there's one baby and there are two people who want to be mothers. So where's a sword? Cut the child in half and you can each have half. Like, is that a solution? Like, that's interesting, isn't it? Like, means like half, but like, and you remember, of course, what happens. The one woman says, very reasonable. That sounds okay. I'm happy to go with that. Thank you. Good, wise king. Thank you. And the other woman says, never. Can't do that. Like, give the child to the other woman, but don't kill the child, for goodness sake. You can't do that. And Solomon, of course, says, well, you are the mother. Because no mother would say that the child can be cut in two, and the real mother has spoken. And everyone looks at it and says, wow, this is a very wise king. And so the accounts of Solomon's wisdom grow and grow. But as you read the account, you get this little shift point that comes as you come to 1 Kings chapter 11, where we are suddenly told of Solomon's many wives. And oh my goodness, Solomon was an extraordinary man. 700 wives and 300 concubines. I mean, that's 1,000 of them. Like, I mean, who has 1,000 wives? Like, I don't know what you're thinking, Solomon, but you can imagine for a moment what it must have been like in the harem there. Like 1,000 women all vying for their husband's attention. I shudder to think what it would have been like. And what was Solomon thinking? Well, part of it was Solomon the shrewd. Many of these marriages were actually about political alliances. Many of them were to curry favor with other kings so that they would look on him with favor as they married princesses from far and wide. But throughout it all, Solomon was violating what God had taught, and had taught very clearly. That in fact the Israelites were not to intermarry, and furthermore you were not supposed to have multiple wives. Now let me just have a little pause thing, because there are two separate questions here. Question number one is the question of foreign wives who will take you away from really loving the Lord your God. Second question is actually the question of polygamy. Now, truth to tell, let's be absolutely candid here. As you read the Old Testament, there are many, many, many instances where people have more than one wife. And people have argued through the era, does the Bible actually teach that we should only marry one person? Or is polygamy actually okay? And as you read, David, was a great king. He had many wives. Many of the patriarchs had many wives. And you could argue, and you could come back and say, well, I'm not sure that the Bible really says that you only have to be married one man to one woman. I'm not sure that that's actually what it teaches. Well, hold on. You must read the Bible wisely. There are indeed many instances in the Bible where you find that, there are multiple wives. But here's the thing. You always, when you read those accounts, read of them in the sense of sadness. You read of them in the sense of, oh, this really didn't work. And you read of them in the sense of, and you know what happened, and you know how difficult that was, and you know that really wasn't optimal, and you know that really, really didn't work. And it's absolutely this case with Solomon as well. He had 700 wives, 300 concubines. And listen to how it's described in the Message. King Solomon was obsessed with women. Pharaoh's daughter was only the first of many foreign wives he loved. Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonite, and Hittite. He took them from the surrounding pagan nations, of which God had clearly warned Israel, you must not marry them. They'll seduce you into infatuations with their gods. Solomon fell in love with them anyway, refusing to give them up. So this is an act of the will. I refuse to give them up. He had 700 royal wives and 300 concubines, 1,000 women in all. And they did seduce him away from God. As Solomon grew older, his wives beguiled him with their alien gods, and he became unfaithful. He didn't stay true to his God, as his father David had done. Solomon took up with Ashtoreth, the whore goddess of the Sidonians, and Malach, the horrible god of the Ammonites. And so you have this really sad conclusion. Solomon the great, Solomon the wise, Solomon the personally stupid. Like in his personal life, it just all fell to pieces. And in the end, what's the consequence? Well, the consequence is actually very, very, very clear. If you go to 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon's given enormous promises, and he's told, if you follow the Lord, if you follow him with all your heart, then in fact your line will continue on forever, and I will honor you, and everything will go well for you and will be good for you. And Solomon, give you wisdom because you asked for it, but you must still follow me with all your heart. You see, you can look at what Solomon prays, and he prays, God, give me wisdom, and you could say God gave it to him, except God didn't give it to him. In other words, God gave it to him in some situations, but in other situations, Solomon just wasn't able to apply it. And it's a great reminder to us that even though God gives us gifts, we are responsible for the way in which we use them. And that just because God gives us something doesn't mean that we don't still have free will, doesn't mean that we can't still trash it, doesn't mean that we can't still throw it to one side and it be of no benefit to us whatsoever. God gives us things, but we need to use them responsibly. We always need to use them responsibly. And Solomon doesn't use what God has given him wisely. And he lets his heart be led astray, and he goes after all these foreign women. And what happens? Like in his own time, it seems to be okay. In his own time, it looks like he gets away with it. In his own time, he just has great wealth and like so much gold that is the passage that John said, read out to us, says, in his day, silver was like nothing. You wouldn't bother to pick up a piece of silver because people were so rich, and like gold you might stoop down for, but silver. They're trying to emphasize this was a great era, but he dies, and in almost no time, the kingdom is split in two. And if you know something of the history of Israel, it's after the death of Solomon that the kingdom divides into two, northern kingdom, southern kingdom. His sons are at war with one another. It's a very ugly period. The legacy just is trashed in no time at all. Solomon the great, no, Solomon the almost great. And it's not just there. You see, it's not just in his relationship with women, it's also in his relationship to how you get things done. So Solomon is fascinating because you might remember that he's the king after David. And David was the king who didn't build the temple of God. If you remember correctly, King David had wanted to build a temple for God, and God had come to him and said, David, you can't build the temple. And so as you read the account, David himself is speaking in 1 Chronicles 28:3. David recalls the time that God said to him, you are not to build a house for my name because you are a warrior and have shed blood. And in 1 Chronicles 22:8-9, it says, but the word of the Lord came to me, this is David speaking, you have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. But you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest. And I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side. His name will be Solomon, and I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign. Now that's fascinating because David is told, David, you've been a warrior king, and because you've been a warrior king and you have blood in your hands, I don't want my temple to be associated with blood. I don't want my temple to be associated with war. I don't want that to be the legacy that's remembered. So I will give you a son, Solomon. He will be a man of peace and rest. Except except that as you actually read the account, yes, there are very few wars in Solomon's time, but when Solomon builds the temple, we're told this, that 1 Kings 9, verse 15, here is the account of the forced labor King Solomon conscripted to build the Lord's temple, his own palace, the terraces, the walls of Jerusalem, and Hazor, Megiddo, and Giza. Here is the account of the forced labor or the slave labor that Solomon conscripted to build the Lord's temple. And you realize that God had been saying, I want a temple that is squeaky clean. And Solomon says, fine, I'll get slaves to build it for you. And he says, Solomon, what were you thinking? Like as you actually read back today, you read of the building of that temple, and you're reminded that it was forced labor that built it. And you say, God had said, I want it to be built by a man of peace. And Solomon, I've given you so much wealth, and I've given you so much wisdom. And Solomon, you're wise enough to have thought of a different way than just getting slaves to build this. Like this is going to be part of your legacy, that slave labor builds the temple of the Lord. Is that really what God was wanting? And you realize, Solomon, you're great, but I don't know. I don't feel really quite at peace with what actually comes out from here. Do you sense the sadness of the passage? It's like all that could have been, but wasn't quite. Like you could have been this amazing king, but foreign wives seduced you and lead you after foreign gods. And you could have been the king of peace, and there was enough wealth for things to go on well, but actually slave labor builds your palace, and slave labor builds your temple. And that's in the end how you remembered. So, Moses, you are amazing. You almost get us into the promised land. And Mr. Smith, you were a great maths teacher, except that you weren't at times. And Solomon, you were an almost great king, except when you weren't. And maybe today we need to ask ourselves the obvious questions. So what is it that is making us almost people? Like almost great, almost right, almost a great marriage, almost a great dad, almost a great mom, almost a great follower of Jesus, almost like, is there something that gets in the way? Like for Solomon, like he knows you're not to go after all these women. And the passage just said, but he decided he'd do it anyway. Like, sorry, I know you say that, God, but I have my own mind, thank you very much. I'm going to go my own way. I mean, that's Solomon's stance. And so he's almost great. He's just not the person he could have been. And what are the things maybe you let get in the way? Or what maybe are the blind spots that you just don't notice? I think I told you a while back of, or it would have been about 40 years ago now, I was working as a chaplain to university students in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. And we'd organised a university mission at the University of Port Elizabeth, and an American evangelist was there. He was a wonderful person. And he was speaking at a meeting just in the kind of public cafe that the university had, and a large crowd had gathered to hear him. There were several hundred people there. And he was speaking, and he had a Bible in his one hand, and he was being funny and making lots of jokes, and people were laughing and enjoying what he was saying. But then he clearly wanted to be hands-free, and at some point, as he was speaking, he just suddenly, this Bible was kind of getting in the way of his hand movement, so he just threw the Bible to someone in the crowd, said, "Catch." And like he did that, it was like this gasp of horror in the audience. I mean, this was South Africa in the 1980s, largely Afrikaans audience, very conservative people, and they just see this Bible being thrown, and people are like, "Oh my goodness, that is sacrilegious, thank you very much, how can you do that?" And within a matter of 1 minute, almost everyone had left. And this poor guy afterwards was like, "What did I do? What did I say? What happened?" And I was like, I think you got a bit of a blind spot there. You read the culture a little wrongly, like you just didn't realize that in this audience, throwing a Bible was never going to work and never going to be okay. And it wasn't because he was evil, and it wasn't because he was horrible, it was just didn't really realize something. And sometimes for us, it's things like that as well. We have just little blind spots where we just don't see some things, and we don't think some things, and we don't realize some things. And so we almost are effective, but not quite. Hey, listen, as I speak, you might almost feel a little bit depressed because you might be thinking of all those things that you've done wrong. Like if I were to say to you, what are the things that you really regret? And they maybe have a long-term price tag. Like those things that should never have happened, but they did. And you might look at them and you say, okay, so one day when someone tells my story, it will be like, do you remember the day that Moses hit the rock? Or do you remember the day when you did whatever it was that you did? And it can sound so sad that we live in this world where all of us have an almost. And the truth is that as you go through the Bible, the heroes have flaws, villains have virtues. The heroes have flaws, except for who? Except for one, who's Jesus. And when you look at Jesus, you actually see that actually there are no qualifications that are given about him at all. Like when you look at Jesus, when you say, Jesus was really great, except such a pity about that time. Like there's nothing to tell, is there? It's like Jesus was great and he did this, and like they're not the qualifications. And yet Jesus is the one who's on the cross, who's dying as the perfect Son of God. And you say, what's happening here? And you recognize that actually this is the heart of our faith. I think it's John Dutton who writes this little poem that says, reaching. I can't reach far enough. So someone stretched out a hand and someone put a nail in it. Reaching, I can't reach far enough. So someone stretched out a hand and someone put a nail in it. And we're reminded that actually the story of Jesus is the story of saying, I know that you're an almost person. I know that there are so many mistakes, so many regrets, so many things that shouldn't have been. But actually this is a faith about grace. This is a faith about forgiveness. This is a faith about like those blind spots that you just don't see, where you do harm and you don't even realize it. Like it's a faith that says, there is forgiveness, and there is hope, and there is the starting again, and it is all because of Jesus. And so when you remember Solomon, the almost great, just remember he's Solomon like you and me. And when you remember Moses, the almost amazing, remember he's just Moses like you and me. And when you remember Mr. Smith, my maths teacher, remember he's actually just amazing Mr. Smith like you and me. All of us in need of grace. All of us able to come to Jesus and say, Lord, I'm sorry. Forgive me. Thank you for hope. Thank you that reaching, I can't reach far enough. You stretched out your hand. Someone put a nail in it and did that for me. Let's pray together. Thank you, Lord, for grace. Thank you that though our heroes have flaws, you bring forgiveness. Thank you that though we are flawed, you bring forgiveness. Thank you that you, perfect Son of God, died in our place that we might be forgiven. Hey, why don't we just be quiet for a moment and just be honest in your own heart. Maybe there is a deep regret you have somewhere and you say, yeah, I know what you're talking about. There are those things that they've just held me back forever. Why not hand them over to the forgiveness of the Father and the forgiveness of Jesus? Just trust them into his hands. Oh Lord Jesus, thank you that because of you, us almost people become whole. Thank you that we find forgiveness and hope and a future, all because of Jesus. Thank you. Amen.